Hey guys, welcome to the lesson on proportions. We've been talking a lot about ratios and rates, which are fractions that describe a division relationship between two quantities. Now what we're going to do is start talking about proportions. A proportion is actually an equation that states that two ratios are equal. So proportion is an equation that states that two ratios, two fractions, are equal. So for example, saying that 1/2 is equal to 2/4, that's a proportion. So in a proportion, it's important to know that the cross products are equal. What that means is the numerator times the denominator of the cross fractions, so for example, the numerator of this one times the denominator of this one, will be equal to the numerator times the denominator of the other cross fractions. Those are called cross products. That's not the same as cross reducing, which is something we use when we multiply fractions. Cross products is a true statement about proportions. When you have a proportion, which is two fractions that are equal to each other, their cross products are the same. 1 times 4 is the same as 2 times 2. That's what makes them a proportion. So to determine whether a pair of ratios is a proportion, we can check their cross products. If their cross products are equal, then they must be a proportion. So if you've got two ratios and the cross product, so A times D, is equal to C times B, then you've got a proportion. If the cross products are not equal, then you don't have a proportion. So taking a look at number 1, we've got 5/6 and 20/4. You might already be able to tell that this does form a proportion, but let's go ahead and set it up as a proportion, and we're asking ourselves, does this form a proportion? If it does, the cross products would be equal. So 5 times 24 would equal 20 times 6. And 5 times 24 does equal 20 times 6, as this is 120 and this is 120. So since the cross products are equal, these two form a proportion. These two ratios form a proportion. You also could have told that they form a proportion because times 4 times 4, they're equivalent fractions. Here's another example of two ratios, and you're checking to see if they form a proportion. You might be able to already tell that these do not. But let's check their cross products. So 2 times 15 makes 30, and 8 times 3 makes 24. Since their cross products are not equal, 2/3 and 8/15 do not form a proportion, so not a proportion. So use your calculator to check the cross products for 3 through 8 and determine whether or not the pair of ratios forms a proportion. Pause the video and do that now. Now we're going to work on solving proportions. That means we have a proportion, which means we have two ratios that are equal to each other, but we're missing one of the values of the ratio, of one of the ratios. So we have to find that missing value. Now many of these are easy to do in our heads, but sometimes we need to do a little algebra magic. So we're going to start with some easy ones to understand the process. Remember that in proportions, the cross products are equal. So in proportions, since the cross products are equal, that means 16 times 3 is equal to 12x in this first example, which means 12x is equal to 48, and if we divide by 12 on both sides, x must be 4, which means that this must be 4, which makes sense because 16 divided by 4 is 4, and 12 divided by 4 is 3. So go ahead and pause the video and try 10, 11, and 12. Again, remember that to solve a proportion, you have to know that the cross products are equal, and then we use algebra to solve for x. For these examples, for some of the more complicated ones, naturally, you can use your calculator. So I'm talking about the ones with like the decimals or the larger values. But you're still going to set up the cross product and show the work. So 4m, or 4 times m, is equal to 1.2 times 11. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply 1.2 by 11 using my calculator. So 13.2 is equal to 4m. And divide both sides by 4. And I'm using my calculator for the computation, but I'm still showing my work of m equals to 3.3. I want to take you over to one more example, which are kind of the challenge questions, but they're really not that big of a challenge because you have a little hint here to remind you to use distribution. So let's zoom in here to number 19 to see what we're talking about. We know this is a proportion because you have two ratios. This is a ratio and this is a ratio. You have two ratios set equal to each other, so this is a proportion. And the way we solve proportions is we know that the cross products are equal. So we're going to go ahead and find those cross products. 2 multiplies to 12, and 3 multiplies to x minus 2, and that is that used distribution. So 3 does not just multiply to x, but it multiplies to all of x minus 2, so we write that as a distributive property. Now we solve using our skills from the last unit. Distribute, and then add 6 to both sides, and then divide by 3 to get that 10 is x. For some of these, you will have to use distributive property twice, like number 22 and number 21. So pause the video now and try those problems. Hopefully you were able to set these up on your own, setting up the cross products equal, so I'll highlight those. Okay, so that's the most important step, is understanding that since these are proportions, since these are two ratios separated by an equal sign, two fractions separated by an equal sign, that's a proportion. And for proportion, the cross products are equal. And that sets up your equation, which then you can break down and solve to get these final answers for -3, 20, and 6. Thanks for watching Solving Proportions.